What if I told you that one of the greatest fortunes in human history was built on a lie? Not a small lie, not a white lie. A deep, rotting, deliberate lie, the kind that sinks into the foundation of a family like water into cracked stone. Slow at first, patient, then devastating. The Rockefeller Dynasty. Say the name slowly. Let it sit on your tongue. It tastes like power, doesn't it? Like marble floors and oil wells and the kind of wealth that ordinary people can barely even imagine. The kind of wealth that buys senators, builds universities, reshapes entire cities. The Rockefeller Empire, at its peak, was not just a fortune. It was a force of nature, a gravitational pull that bent the world around it. Schools carry their name. Museums. Entire city blocks in Manhattan. A family so powerful that when their interests spoke, our governments listened. When their lawyers moved, markets shifted. But here's what they don't teach you in the history books. Here's what gets buried under the marble and the philanthropy and the carefully polished legacy of the Rockefeller dynasty. The blood. The children who burned alive in a pit while machine guns fired overhead. The young heir who walked into a jungle and never walked back out. The grief. The scandal. The darkness that chased this family across 4 generations like a curse that no amount of money, not even Rockefeller money, could lift. This is not a story about success. This is a story about what success costs and who gets left to pay the bill. The Rockefeller dark history is longer and heavier than almost anyone knows. Today, we uncover it, all of it. The sins, the blood, the mystery, and the tragedies that kept coming no matter how high the towers climbed. If you're brave enough to face the dark truths hidden behind one of history's greatest fortunes, smash that like button right now. Subscribe to Business Behind Fame for more uncovered business horrors. Hit the bell so you don't miss a single revelation, and let's descend into the abyss together. Chapter 1. Who was John D. Rockefeller? How did the Rockefeller Empire begin? Every haunted house has a foundation. And the foundation of the Rockefeller Empire was laid by a man the neighbors called Devil Bill, William Avery Rockefeller. Born 1810 in upstate New York. Raised in rural poverty. The kind of poverty that hardens some men into quiet decency and turns others into something more dangerous, something hungry, calculating, and permanently unimpressed by rules. Devil Bill chose hungry. So if you're asking the real question, how did John D. Rockefeller make his fortune? You have to start here. With this man, with this wagon, with this poison. Because the Rockefeller dynasty didn't begin in a boardroom. It began with a con. Imagine a dirt road in rural Ohio, 1840s. The air smells like horse sweat and dust and the distant sweetness of wood fires burning somewhere in the hills. A wagon creaks around a bend. Sitting up top, easy as a man going to Sunday service, is Devil Bill. Big shoulders, beard like a frontier prophet. A grin that could sell you the coat off his back and make you feel lucky about the transaction. In the wagon bed behind him, bottles, dark glass, brown liquid inside, corked tight and labeled with magnificent, soaring promises. Cancer? He had a cure. Liver trouble? Gone in a week. Tumors? He'd treated hundreds of them. He'd swear it. PBS. American Experience's landmark documentary on the Rockefeller family confirms what historians have established across decades of research. The substance Devil Bill sold was almost certainly crude petroleum oil, the same raw black stuff seeping from Pennsylvania ground, cut with whatever made it easier to swallow. He called it medicine. He charged $25 a bottle. In an era when a working man might earn $1 a day, $25 was a devastating sum. Enough to feed a family for weeks. He had no training, no license, no shame. He would set up in a town square and perform. That's the right word, perform. He was a showman before he was a swindler, though the line between those two things in his case was invisible. He'd gather a crowd with the energy of a carnival barker, collect his money with the practiced calm of a preacher taking the offering, and then he would vanish before anyone noticed nobody was getting better. 3 counties over, fresh faces, same bottles, same promises. But the Rockefeller controversy goes deeper than the wagon. Devil Bill was a bigamist. He had a wife, Eliza, a devout and enduring woman who kept his household and raised his children through his frequent, extended, unexplained absences. She prayed for a husband who deserved her prayers. She never quite got one, because Devil Bill had another woman, a second family, maintained in a different county, under a slightly different version of himself. 2 wives, 2 households. One man slipping between them like smoke through a cracked door. He was also suspected of horse theft, Records across multiple states document unpaid debts, changed names, deliberately muddied trails. He borrowed money with no realistic intention of repaying it. He was charming to everyone who hadn't yet learned to check their pockets after shaking his hand. And here is the detail that explains everything that followed. Devil Bill swindled his own sons, deliberately, as a teaching method. He would sell them things at prices he inflated, lend them small sums at interest, set up trades designed to leave them on the losing end, watch them absorb the defeat, and then, when the boy looked up confused and stung, he would laugh. "I cheat my boys every chance I get," he reportedly told neighbors. Multiple biographers, including Ron Chernow in his exhaustive biography Titan, have documented this boast. "I want to make 'em sharp." Sharp. Young John Davison Rockefeller. Quiet, meticulous, deeply religious. Watching all of this with those steady eyes, absorbed every lesson. Not just the mechanics of business, the philosophy underneath the business. That the world is divided into those who take and those who are taken. That sentiment is a weakness your competitor will exploit. That the distance between winning and losing is the willingness to do what the other man hesitates to do. His mother gave him faith. His father gave him something older and colder than faith. John D. went into business in Cleveland as a young man. He was exceptional in ways that had nothing to do with charisma or luck. He was meticulous about accounts, obsessive about detail. He saw crude oil, Pennsylvania crude, the new black blood of American industry flooding the market in the 1860s. And he saw, with brilliant and ruthless clarity, a chaos that could be controlled. That should be controlled. By him. He built Standard Oil. He undercut competitors and then bought them when they were broken. He made secret arrangements with railroads, rebate schemes documented extensively by journalist Ida Tarbell in her landmark 1904 investigation and later confirmed by federal courts, that gave Standard Oil shipping rates no competitor could match or even know about. He absorbed, consolidated, swallowed. By the mid-1880s, Standard Oil controlled somewhere between 90 and 91% of all oil refining in the United States. One man, one company, one absolute stranglehold on an entire nation's industrial fuel supply. At his peak, John D. Rockefeller's personal fortune, adjusted for today's economy, sat somewhere between $400 and $700 billion. He was, by any credible calculation, the wealthiest private individual in the history of recorded human civilization. He gave to churches every week his entire adult life, tithing from his very first paycheck. He funded the University of Chicago from scratch. He built institutions. He read scripture every morning. He genuinely seemed, to believe that God had selected him for this accumulation of wealth and that he had a sacred obligation to use it constructively. And yet, the Rockefeller dark history cannot be separated from the methods, the ruthlessness, the absolute conviction that victory justified the route taken to reach it. Devil Bill's philosophy, scaled up from one wagon on a country road to an empire that touched every corner of American life, had not been discarded. It had been refined, institutionalized, wrapped in the language of divine will and good works and the rhetoric of efficiency. But foundations don't disappear just because you build something beautiful on top of them. They hold, or they crack. And the foundation of the Rockefeller dynasty was already cracked before John D. ever bought his first oil refinery. The crack ran straight through the family's moral core, through the belief that human beings were, at their most essential, either instruments of your ambition or obstacles to it. That their suffering was a regrettable externality, a cost of business. One morning in Colorado in 1914, that crack split open. And what poured out of it was not oil. Chapter 2. The Ludlow Massacre Explained. What happened at the Ludlow Massacre? This is the chapter of the Rockefeller dark history that most people have never heard. And it is the worst one. Southern Colorado, April 1914. The air tastes like coal dust, a constant grit at the back of the throat, the permanent flavor of men who spend their lives underground. It smells like wood smoke from 1,000 cook fires and cold coming off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and something underneath all of it. Something chemical, acrid. The smell of what's coming. The tent colony at Ludlow had been standing since September 1913. Around 1,200 people called it home, striking coal miners and their families, driven from their company-owned housing because they had dared to stop working. Dared to demand better. They worked, or had worked, the mines owned by Colorado Fuel and Iron. CF&I, a company in which the Rockefeller family held substantial controlling interest. John D. Rockefeller Jr., Junior, the son raised in his father's faith and his father's fortune, more refined and more publicly religious than the old man, but no less deeply invested in the financial machinery, was involved at the management level. The company answered ultimately to New York, to him. The Rockefeller controversy around Ludlow begins here, with what the miners were actually asking for. An 8-hour workday. The right to live somewhere other than company-owned housing, housing from which the company could evict you the moment you complained about anything, the moment you organized, the moment you asked a question they didn't want to answer. The right to shop somewhere other than the company store, which set its own prices in a market it controlled entirely. The right to have your coal weighed honestly, because CF and I weighed the coal themselves, and the scales had a funny habit of reading light. These were not radical demands. They were not the demands of agitators or revolutionaries. They were the demands of human beings who wanted to be treated like human beings. CF and I said no. The miners walked out. They set up the tent colony at Ludlow, across the railroad tracks from the mine entrance, and they settled in to wait. Winter came, a hard Colorado winter, bitter cold, children sick, money running low, no end in sight. They held. The Colorado National Guard arrived, nominally to maintain order. But here is the Rockefeller controversy at its most documented and damning. As Britannica and PBS American Experience both confirm, CF and I was partially funding the Guard's operations. The men with the guns and the authority of the state were, in effect, on the company's payroll. Neutrality was a fiction. Tensions gathered through the long winter and into spring like a storm building on the horizon. April 20th, 1914. A shot rang out in the morning. Nobody alive today can say with certainty who fired it. Accounts conflict. Blame has been assigned in every direction across more than a century of historical examination. But here is what is not in dispute. What is written not in argument but in ash and bone. The National Guard opened fire on the tent colony, with rifles first. Then, and this is confirmed in eyewitness testimony, recorded by journalists at the time and preserved in the Colorado State Archives, with machine guns. Machine guns, mounted on the ridges above the colony, aimed downward, into canvas tents where women were making breakfast, where children were waking up, where families were beginning another cold morning of waiting for justice. The sound was the sound of the world being torn apart at a seam. That mechanical, continuous, unforgiving tearing that did not stop. Miners grabbed their own rifles and fired back. Some of them fought with genuine ferocity. These were men who had already given everything. Their health, their winter, their savings. They fought. But they were outgunned and exposed, and they could not hold the ridges. Women grabbed children and ran. Where do you run when the bullets come from above? When the flanks are covered and the open ground offers nothing? You go down. You put the earth itself between your children and the men with the guns. Under one large tent near the center of the colony, a shallow pit had been dug, a practical cellar for food storage, for keeping things cool in the summer heat. On the morning of April 20th, families crawled into that pit. 13 people, 11 children, 2 women. They pressed themselves into the dark and the cold dirt, and they held each other and they waited for it to stop. The shooting did not stop. In the afternoon, here the accounts from PBS, the Colorado State Historical Society, and Britannica converge with devastating, unanswerable precision. National Guard soldiers and company guards moved through what remained of the colony, with torches, with kerosene. They lit the tents. One after another, the canvas went up. Orange and hungry and immediate, the fire spreading with a speed that stole the breath before the heat even arrived. The smoke was black and thick and absolute, the kind of smoke that doesn't just fill a space but takes it, that coats the inside of your throat and turns every breath into a small, desperate negotiation. The heat was a physical wall, the kind of heat that warps metal and turns wood to nothing and makes the air itself feel like something solid pressing down on your chest. The fire reached the pit. The smoke poured in. 11 children, 2 women, 13 people in a hole in the ground. They could not get out. The women tried. The record does not tell us exactly what happened in those final minutes in the darkness beneath the burning tent. The record doesn't need to. 13 people went into that pit. None of them came out alive. They suffocated. They burned. In a cellar in the Colorado earth, while the guns fired overhead and the world they had known turned to ash above them. The cellar became known, immediately and ever after, as the death pit. When the shooting finally slowed. When the colony lay in smoldering ruins, when the metallic reek of spent ammunition mixed with the char of everything those families had owned, the survivors came back. Mothers, fathers, people who had run when the first shots came, who had hidden in creek beds and scrub brush, who had survived, and who now walked back through ash that was still warm beneath their feet, calling names, hearing nothing. The official death toll from the Ludlow Massacre is 21 people. Historians note that the number climbs when accounting for deaths in the broader armed uprising that followed, the 10 Days' War, when miners across the Colorado coalfields rose with rifles in outrage and fought pitched battles with state forces for more than a week. The Labor Department eventually sent federal troops to restore order. It remains, by any serious accounting, the deadliest labor conflict in American history. And John D. Rockefeller Jr. was in New York. He initially defended CF&I management publicly. He called the strikers agitators. He said the company had been right to stand firm. He said things, on the record, cut to reporters. That read today like a historical document of moral catastrophe written in plain daylight. The reaction was immediate and ferocious. Crowds gathered outside his offices at 26 Broadway in Manhattan. Women in black carrying photographs of the Ludlow dead. Upton Sinclair organized demonstrations where mourners marched in absolute silence past the Rockefeller building, the silence of accusation, of graves. Mother Jones, Mary Harris Jones, the legendary labor organizer who had spent decades in the coal country, who knew these communities from the ground up, was incandescent. Her public denunciations of Junior burned through newspaper pages across America. He hired Ivy Lee, a founding figure of modern public relations, to manage what had become an international scandal. He eventually visited the mines, shook hands with workers, implemented some reforms. He spent the rest of his long life building museums, funding the arts, donating the land for the United Nations headquarters, restoring colonial Williamsburg. He became, by many genuine measures, a changed and philanthropic man. But the death pit was still there. The ash was still in the Colorado soil, and 11 children had suffocated and burned in a hole beneath a fire that Rockefeller money, Rockefeller wages paid to Rockefeller guards, had made possible. The Rockefeller empire was crimson now, and the stain does not wash out. If this blood-soaked chapter has you gripped and you crave more true crime dives into cursed empires, drop a like right now. Comment which dark business story we should expose next. Subscribe to Business Behind Fame. And share this with someone who needs to know the real cost of power. Was Michael Rockefeller killed and eaten? Fuels these revelations. Keep watching. Chapter 3. The Disappearance of Michael Rockefeller. Half a century passes. The Rockefeller empire has been polished and rebuilt. The name has been reattached to philanthropic greatness. Junior's sons have gone into public life. David into banking and the chairmanship of Chase Manhattan, Lawrence into venture capital and conservation, Winthrop into politics, and Nelson into the New York governorship with his eyes permanently fixed on something higher. Nelson Rockefeller, the biggest, loudest, most politically magnetic of Junior's sons. 4 terms as governor of New York, vice president of the United States under Gerald Ford. A man who spent decades absolutely certain the White House was going to be his eventually. He had a son named Michael. And the story of Michael Rockefeller's disappearance is one of the most haunting mysteries in the entire Rockefeller family tragedy. It is a story that people have asked about for more than 60 years. What happened to Michael Rockefeller? Was Michael Rockefeller killed and eaten? These are not sensational questions invented by tabloids. They are questions that serious journalists and historians, drawing on decades of fieldwork and archival research, have concluded deserve serious answers. Michael Clark Rockefeller was 23 years old in 1961. Harvard graduate. Thoughtful where his father was loud. Earnest where his father was calculating. He had the lean, open face of a young man who still believed that the world held wonders worth seeking, that his family's immense wealth was an opportunity for discovery rather than just the accumulation of more wealth. He was fascinated by indigenous art, not European masters, which his family could acquire easily and did. Something older, something that felt to him more immediate, more alive, the carved wooden ancestor poles and ceremonial shields of the Asmat people, living on the remote southwestern coast of what is now Indonesia and Papua, New Guinea. He had been there before. He was going back. The Asmat region in 1961 was about as far from the Rockefeller world as it is physically possible to travel while remaining on the same planet. No electricity, no running water, no roads, no newspapers, no telephones, no infrastructure connecting it to the outside world in any meaningful way. Just dense, breathing jungle coming down to tidal rivers the color of dark tea. mangrove swamps where the mud smells of rot and salt and ancient organic things. Humidity so total and so heavy that you don't feel wet. You simply feel submerged. Like the air itself is another medium. The sounds of the Asmat at night are not sounds from the world most people inhabit. Things call in the darkness from the upper canopy. Water moves through root systems in rhythms that suggest breathing. Insects produce noise at a volume and complexity that is almost architectural. And beneath it all, a silence that is not actually silent. A silence full of presence. Full of the sense that you are being observed by something that has been here for 10,000 years and is entirely unimpressed by your last name. The Asmat people were headhunters. This is documented history, confirmed by anthropologists and researchers across decades of study, and Carl Hoffman's 2014 book Savage Harvest, published after years of fieldwork in the region and presented as careful, rigorously sourced journalism, addresses it directly. Headhunting and ritual cannibalism were integrated into Asmat spiritual life. They were not random violence. They were part of a coherent belief system about power, vengeance, and the obligations of the living to the dead. And here is the piece that transforms the Rockefeller disappearance from a drowning tragedy into something far darker. A few years before Michael arrived in the Asmat, Dutch colonial police, the European power still administering the region at the time, had conducted a punitive raid on the village of Otjanep. Several Asmat men were killed. The community was publicly humiliated, stripped of weapons, forced to submit. And by Asmat's spiritual reckoning, a reckoning as binding and as real as any legal system, just rooted in different foundations, a debt had been created. The spirits of the dead demanded payment in blood. Michael didn't know this. On November 18, 1961, the catamaran he was traveling on capsized in rough open water several miles offshore. The sea off the Asmat coast does not offer easy forgiveness. It is warm, murky, moved by strong tidal currents, and it is home to sharks. The boat went over, and suddenly 2 men were in the water, still clinging to the upturned hull miles from shore with no rescue in sight. The other man, René Wassing, a Dutch anthropologist, stayed with the boat and waited. Michael looked toward the distant green line of the shore. He tied 2 empty plastic jerrycans to his body for buoyancy. "I think I can make it," he said. He slipped into the water. The Asmat jungle took him. That is the only way to say it accurately. He went into the water. The shore received him, or it didn't. The jungle took him, and it has never given him back. The official position for decades was drowning. Sharks, exhaustion. The sea claims people and keeps them. Tragic, mysterious. But ultimately, the kind of thing that happens to men who make dangerous decisions in dangerous places. But then Carl Hoffman went to the Asmat. He spent years there. He learned the language. He earned the trust of elderly people who had been alive in 1961, who had been children and young adults when the white man from the outside world had appeared. And what he found, documented in Savage Harvest and reported in Smithsonian Magazine, reshapes the entire Rockefeller disappearance. He found witnesses. Consistent, corroborating, independent witnesses who described a white man coming ashore near the village of Otjanep. The village that had suffered in the Dutch police raid. The village that, by their own spiritual accounting, was owed a blood debt from the outside world. The testimony, gathered with patience and cultural sensitivity, presented by Hoffman as credible without being declared absolute, describes what happened next. Michael made it to shore. And the men who found him saw not just a stranger. They saw an answer. The crack of something in the dark of the jungle. The sound of ceremony. Of chanting that moves through the night air and through the chest like something physical. The metallic sweetness that hangs in humid air after violence. What the witnesses described, what Hoffman presents as the most credible explanation of the Rockefeller disappearance available to us, is ritualistic killing and cannibalism, and the preservation of Michael's skull as a sacred object, a source of transferred spiritual power, integrated into the life of the community. No body was ever officially recovered. Dutch colonial authorities reportedly possessed documentation that suggested they knew or suspected more than they ever disclosed publicly, records that, according to Hoffman's research, were suppressed to protect the fragile politics of a decolonizing region in a Cold War world where stability mattered more than one missing American heir. Nelson Rockefeller, the governor, the vice president, the man who projected absolute command in every room he ever entered, said publicly that his son had drowned. He got back on his plane. He returned to New York. He kept governing, kept campaigning, kept climbing. What does a father carry when the official story might not be the real one? When a jungle has swallowed his son and the archives have been tidied and the only people who might know the truth speak a language that his world spent centuries dismissing, Michael Rockefeller walked into one of the most ancient, the most primal places on earth, carrying the name of the family that had bent the modern world to its will. In that water, in that jungle, the name meant nothing. He was just a man, and the jungle kept him. Chapter 4. Rockefeller Family Tragedies. Rockefeller Family Scandals. Explained by now, you can feel the pattern. If you've been watching closely, if you've been listening, you've felt it building across these decades. This accumulation of catastrophe that does not pause for grief, does not acknowledge the giving of hospitals or universities or conservation land, does not care how many times the family name has been attached to something beautiful. The Rockefeller family tragedies keep coming. The Rockefeller family scandals keep finding them. This is the chapter that never ends. In 1951, a woman named Winifred Rockefeller Emeny, connected through the sprawling, branching Rockefeller dynasty, locked herself in a garage with her 2 young daughters. She started the engine. Carbon monoxide is colorless and patient. It comes for you gently at first, and then it doesn't stop. She killed herself and both of her children, a family sitting atop one of the greatest accumulations of resources in human history, and a mother so deep in her darkness that she saw no door except that one. The wealth doesn't touch the darkness inside. It never has. It never will. That is one of the central, irreducible truths of the Rockefeller family tragedy. In 1978, John D. Rockefeller III, grandson of the founder, a man who spent his adult life in genuine and documented service to the arts and population issues and conservation, a man who by all accounts was decent and earnest and trying, died in a car collision near his family estate in Westchester County, New York. Near land his family had owned for decades, on roads he had driven hundreds of times, in the landscape of his own inheritance. The world couldn't protect him from a single moment of terrible, ordinary chance. In 2014, Dr. Richard Rockefeller, great-grandson of John Sr., a physician who had dedicated substantial portions of his career to humanitarian medicine, to delivering healthcare into disaster zones and war zones, to being useful in ways that had nothing to do with his last name, climbed into his small Cessna at Westchester County Airport on a foggy June morning. He had just spent the weekend with his father, David Rockefeller. David was 99 years old, father and son together. Then Richard said goodbye, drove to the airport, and flew away. The plane came down in the trees minutes after takeoff. David Rockefeller lived to be 101 years old. He buried his son. Think about what that means. Think about what a father carries when the child goes first and the child was trying to heal the world and the fog took him anyway. And then there is Nelson Rockefeller, governor, vice president, the man who Richard Nixon beat for the 1968 Republican nomination in one of the great near misses of American political history, died in January 1979. He was 70 years old. He was with a 25-year-old aide named Megan Marshak at his Manhattan townhouse. The official account, they were working late on an art book project. The timeline of events that evening, when exactly Nelson collapsed, how much time passed before anyone called for help, who was present and when, has never been entirely resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Contemporary journalists, including reporters covering the story in real time for New York papers, noted inconsistencies in the initial accounts. The gap between when Marshak reportedly discovered Nelson in distress and when emergency services were contacted attracted significant scrutiny that was never fully answered. One of the most powerful men of the 20th century died in circumstances complicated enough that they have been discussed, questioned, and whispered about ever since. The Rockefeller Empire's vast machinery of public relations and legal protection closed around the story almost immediately. Power protects itself, even from the truth about its endings. And then, in a chapter of Rockefeller family scandals that almost defies belief, there is the man who was not a Rockefeller at all, Christian Gerhardsreiter, German-born, a conman of extraordinary patience, nerve, and apparent psychological gift for becoming whoever a room needed him to be. He spent decades in the United States constructing and shedding identities. He was, at various points, a British aristocrat named Christopher Chichester, a Hollywood producer, and then, most audaciously, most successfully, Clark Rockefeller, a charming, eccentric, apparently well-connected member of the Rockefeller dynasty. He wasn't. No blood connection, no family tie. Nothing but a stolen name and the absolute confidence to deploy it in Manhattan's higher social circles. He married. He had a daughter. He attended the right events. Knew the right references. radiated the specific kind of old money eccentricity that sophisticated people found reassuring rather than suspicious. He fooled people for years. When a custody dispute led investigators to look more carefully at who Clark Rockefeller actually was, the fiction collapsed, and beneath it was something far darker than a social climber with a false name. In California, in 1985, a couple named John and Linda Sohus had disappeared. They had rented their guest house to a young German man. Their remains were eventually discovered, buried on their own property. Court records from the 2013 murder trial, covered extensively in the Los Angeles Times and national outlets, document what the jury concluded that Christian Gerhardsreiter had killed John Sohus, a man who had worn the Rockefeller name like a costume. Who had used one of the most famous names in American history, a name built over 4 generations of empire and philanthropy and tragedy, as cover for a life of fraud and violence, the name that Devil Bill's grandson had made synonymous with American power, stolen by a murderer, worn like a mask. Even that, even the name, could not escape the darkness. So here we stand, at the end of what we can see. At the edge of the Rockefeller dynasty's long, complicated, blood-stained arc, a wagon on a country road carrying poison in dark bottles. 11 children in a pit in Colorado, breathing smoke that turned into their last breath. A young man slipping into black water at the edge of the world, stepping from the top rung of the greatest family fortune in history directly into the oldest and most primal darkness human beings have ever faced. Planes falling from winter skies, a vice president dying in circumstances that never quite added up, a mother who locked her children in a car and ran the engine, a murderer who wore their name like borrowed clothes. The Rockefeller family tragedies do not follow a single thread. They are not a simple story. And the Rockefeller dynasty did do genuine, measurable, documented good in the world. The hospitals exist, the university exists, the conservation land exists, the arts institutions exist. These are real. But all the gold in the world could not buy those children back from the death pit. All the philanthropy in the world could not pull Michael Rockefeller out of the Asmat water. All the power and the marble and the famous name could not keep the fog from the runway or keep the cars from colliding on a Westchester road. Is it a curse? The supernatural answer is yours to believe or dismiss. This is not a story that requires the supernatural to be devastating. The facts on their own are devastating enough. But there is another kind of curse, not the kind spoken by witches, the kind built into the logic of certain choices, the kind that says, if you construct an empire on the systematic suppression of human beings, their labor, their wages, their dignity, their lives, the weight of that suppression does not simply evaporate because you later write a check to a museum. The Rockefeller controversy, understood this way, is not mysterious at all. It is physics. What is taken accumulates somewhere. What is denied festers. What burns in a pit in Colorado doesn't disappear just because time moves forward and the powerful write better press releases. Devil Bill taught his son to be sharp. John D. built the sharpest empire the modern world had ever seen, and the sharpest thing in the entire Rockefeller dark history, the most cutting, inescapable irony, is this. The fortune that was supposed to be the answer to every question was always asking one question in return. What is the price of all this? The answer is written in ash, in black water, in jungle silence, in a pit beneath burning canvas. And it is still being written. The Rockefeller Curse whispers that no fortune can outrun its ghosts. If this story chilled you and you want more rise and fall horrors exposing the dark side of business legends, subscribe now to Business Behind Fame. Turn on notifications, hit like if it hit hard, and comment below. Do you believe the curse is real? Is it karma? Is it coincidence? Is it just the cold, patient mathematics of empires built on blood? We read every comment, every one. We want to know where you stand. Thanks for facing the shadows with us. The next dark tale is already waiting.